The corridor was almost empty when the shots rang out, 5 cracks, sharp, unmistakable, each one slicing through the sterile silence of St. Andrew's Hospital like a blade through glass. Security cameras caught only fragments, the glint of a surgical badge, a flash of a white coat, the echo of a voice shouting something no one could fully make out. Then silence, just a body on the polished floor. Blood spreading beneath the light of an exit sign that flickered as if it too couldn't believe what it was seeing. Her name was Claire Morgan, 31 years old. A surgical matron known for precision, calm, and a quiet kind of courage that made her indispensable. Minutes earlier, she had been assisting the hospital's chief surgeon, Dr. Nathan Hale, on a marathon transplant, 12 hours of controlled chaos, saving a life. Now she was the one fighting for hers. Nurses burst through the double doors, shouting orders, "Get a gurney, get Dr. Sharma!" Voices breaking, hands trembling, someone pressed on the wounds, someone else screamed her name. She was still breathing. Barely. And as the medics wheeled her past the mural that read "Excellence in Care Since 1954, the cameras caught something strange. Hale, the hospital's celebrated CEO and star surgeon, walking away, not running. Just walking down the same corridor, disappearing into the cold blue light of the parking garage. Within hours, police sealed off the East Wing. The hospital's board issued a statement calling it a tragic incident. But anyone who had worked inside those walls knew something had been brewing long before that night. Because Claire had been asking questions, dangerous ones, questions about missing medications, irregular patient charts, and a growing list of unexplained deaths that the hospital quietly attributed to post-operative complications. But Claire didn't believe in coincidences, and the deeper she dug, the darker the answers became. In the days leading up to the shooting, colleagues noticed her staying late after shifts, copying files, downloading footage, and meeting a man from the compliance office in the staff cafeteria after hours. She was preparing a report that would have landed on the desk of the hospital board by Monday morning, except Monday never came for her. It was Friday night when she was shot 5 times in the East Corridor, and yet she lived. By dawn, the city was waking to headlines that didn't make sense. Prominent surgeon missing after hospital shooting, matron critical following workplace attack. In a place dedicated to saving lives, someone had tried to silence the very person trying to protect them. The story that would unfold over the next few weeks would expose one of the most shocking scandals in modern medical history. A web of greed, betrayal, and power so entrenched it reached far beyond hospital walls. Because what Claire discovered wasn't just theft or negligence. It was a black market operation built on stolen organs, falsified records, and lives treated as inventory. But before the headlines, before the trial, before the world would know the name Dr. Nathan Hale for all the wrong reasons, there was just a young nurse standing in a fluorescent hallway, holding the truth in her trembling hands, not realizing she had just become the target of the man she trusted most. What happened that night changed everything. But to understand why it happened and how it was even possible, we have to go back to the beginning, to the months when St. Andrews still looked perfect from the outside, when smiles hid secrets, and when one woman's courage began to unravel a system designed to keep her silent. Before we dive deeper, if stories like this move you the way they moved me while crafting them, please consider subscribing. It truly helps me keep uncovering these stories that deserve to be told. Long before the headlines, long before the hallway turned into a crime scene, St. Andrew's Hospital was a place people admired. It stood tall on the east side of the city, a fortress of white walls, glass, and reputation, doctors in crisp coats. Nurses moving like clockwork from the outside. It was everything healthcare was meant to be: precise, clean, humane. And at the heart of it all was Claire Morgan. To her colleagues, Claire was the quiet engine that kept the surgical ward alive. She wasn't loud, but when things went wrong in the OR, when someone's heartbeat crashed or panic took over, it was her voice that cut through the noise. "Stay with me," she'd say, her tone unshakable, her hands steady. She believed in people. She believed in systems. She believed that if you worked hard and told the truth, the world had a way of taking care of you. That belief would soon be tested in ways she could never imagine. Her days started before sunrise: coffee, hair tied back, badge clipped to her scrubs, 12-hour shifts that often became 16. Her apartment was small, 1 bedroom, always tidy, the kind of order that only people under pressure keep, as if neatness can balance the chaos they face every day. Friends said she had a sense for when something wasn't right. She noticed small things: A missing syringe here, a chart signed by the wrong person there, little things most people brushed off as clerical mistakes, but Claire didn't brush things off. Low, subtle heartbeat sound under narration. It started with a patient named Elias Turner, mid-50s, ordinary surgery, gallbladder removal routine, textbook, except Elias never woke up. The report listed anesthetic complications, but when Claire reviewed the chart, she found something off, a dosage written in 2 different inks, 2 different hands. She flagged it quietly, brought it up to administration. They thanked her, told her they'd handle it internally. Weeks passed, nothing changed, then another patient, another complication, another signed chart that didn't match. Claire began keeping her own notes, dates, batch numbers, even the names of who was on shift. She didn't know what she was building, just that something beneath the surface was wrong. She wanted to believe it was a pattern of negligence. She hoped it wasn't something worse. That's when she first met Dr. Nathan Hale. To most, he was a legend, a surgeon who had built the hospital's transplant program from scratch, charismatic, brilliant, quoted in journals. He gave speeches about medical ethics that made even senior staff tear up. But Claire saw another side. He had a temper, the kind that hid behind smiles and applause. He expected perfection not from himself but from everyone around him. A mistake wasn't just a mistake, it was an embarrassment. And in a place like St. Andrews, embarrassment meant exile. Still, he noticed her, he praised her skill, her loyalty, her attention to detail. He even requested her personally for difficult surgeries, and for a while Claire believed it was because he trusted her. She didn't realize he was watching her closely. Around that time, the hospital began expanding, new equipment, more transplants, more publicity, but with growth came shadows. Files went missing. Inventory counts didn't match. Donations that were supposed to fund pediatric care suddenly got redirected to research. And that's when the whispers began, whispers about organs, the ones that never made it to the official transplant list. Claire overheard a conversation one night, 2 orderlies talking in the storage hall. One joked, "Guess the rich don't wait in line for kidneys, huh?" The other laughed nervously and changed the subject. Claire didn't think much of it then, but that sentence would echo in her mind for months. In the staff lounge, people adored Dr. Hale. He was the kind of man who made everyone feel seen until they weren't useful anymore. He'd drop your name in a meeting, thank you for your dedication, and then quietly reassign you if you asked too many questions. That's how St. Andrews stayed spotless, no leaks, no mistakes, just silence. And then there was the audit. It began as a routine compliance review. Every department had to submit monthly reports. Claire, always meticulous, submitted hers early. But one night, while helping a new nurse print her files, she noticed something. The system wouldn't let them access previous month's reports. They were gone. Archived, the message said. Except the IT department later confirmed nothing had been archived. Someone had deleted them. That's when the tension really began. Hale called her into his office. He smiled too much, said he'd heard she was concerned about the records. He told her not to worry, that the hospital takes care of its own. And as he said it, his tone wasn't reassuring, it was warning. Claire left his office shaken. For the first time in her career, she felt unsafe in a place meant to heal. But she didn't stop. She reached out quietly to a friend from nursing school now working in compliance. His name was Evan Cross. She asked if he could look into something for her anonymously. Evan agreed on one condition: don't dig too deep, not yet. He was right to warn her, because what he found next would pull her into a world far darker than she imagined. Over the next few weeks, Evan discovered discrepancies in the transplant database. Patients listed as deceased who had actually been discharged weeks earlier, donor organs that appeared on records but were never matched to recipients, entire surgeries that, according to paperwork, never happened. When he showed the data to Claire, she stared at the screen in disbelief. Her hands trembled. "Where did they go?" she whispered. Evan didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing: someone at the top was manipulating the data, and that meant this wasn't negligence, it was deliberate. Claire had a choice: pretend she hadn't seen it like so many before her, or do what her conscience demanded. She chose the latter. In her journal, found later by investigators, she wrote one line that said it all. "If healing means hiding the truth, then we've already lost what medicine stands for." The next week, she began copying files onto a personal drive, quietly, methodically. surveillance footage, internal memos, and confidential schedules. She was building a case and she was close. But someone noticed? Security logs showed unauthorized access from her terminal late one night. Less than 24 hours later, Hale requested she assist him personally in a rare transplant procedure, one scheduled unusually late on a Friday. The same Friday she would be shot. It was supposed to be a routine operation, a chance for her to prove herself again, but beneath the bright lights of the operating room she couldn't shake a feeling. The air felt heavier. Hale was quieter than usual, and when the surgery ended he didn't thank her, he simply said, "Stay behind, we need to talk." That's where her story turns from dedication to danger, from loyalty to survival. If you were in Claire's place at this moment, would you have noticed the danger signs? Be honest, what would you have done? The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. Most of St. Andrews had gone dark, lights dimmed, corridors empty, the night staff moving like ghosts through fluorescent hallways. But in operating room 3, the air was still heavy with the smell of disinfectant and adrenaline. The surgery had lasted nearly 12 hours, a double organ transplant, the kind that could make or break a surgeon's reputation. When it was over, Dr. Nathan Hale removed his gloves with deliberate calm. He didn't thank the team. He didn't smile. He just stared at Claire, eyes unreadable, and said quietly, "Stay behind, we need to talk." The rest of the staff left, one by one. The sound of their shoes faded until it was just the hum of the ventilator and the faint rattle of metal trays. Claire stood by the door, hands still gloved, pulse rising. She thought maybe it was about the report she'd been compiling, the files she'd copied, the data she'd given to Evan. Maybe Hale had found out, maybe this was her moment to come clean. Hale turned to her, leaned against the counter, and spoke in that calm, deliberate tone he was known for. He said he'd heard things, that she'd been raising unnecessary concerns. He called it misunderstanding hospital protocol, then his tone changed. "You're a good nurse, Claire. I'd hate to see your name attached to something that could ruin your career." It wasn't a warning, it was a threat, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted to be understood. She asked him quietly, "What are you hiding?" For the first time his smile faded. He stepped closer, too close, then he said something she'd never forget. "You don't know what you're talking about, and trust me, you don't want to." She took a step back, her voice trembling but firm. "I already know enough," she said, "and I'm not stopping." Hale's expression hardened, that thin line between charm and rage finally snapping. He said nothing, just walked out. Claire exhaled, not realizing that would be the last time she'd see him alive, at least free. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Claire returned to the records room. She needed one more file, a list of post-op patients connected to Hale's private donor program. The corridor cameras would later show her carrying a folder, heading toward the East Wing, the most isolated part of the hospital. At the same time, another camera caught Hale leaving his office, coat over his arm, heading the same way. No one knows exactly what was said in that hallway, but according to witness statements, there were raised voices. Someone shouted her name, then the sound of 5 shots. The echoes traveled through the empty corridor. Security rushed in seconds later, but Hale was already gone. His car was later found abandoned in the hospital's underground garage, the driver's door open, engines still running. Meanwhile, in the ER, the team she'd trained with worked frantically to save her life. 5 gunshot wounds, chest, shoulder, abdomen. She had lost over half her blood volume, but she was still conscious when they found her. One of the nurses swore she whispered something before she went under anesthesia, 2 words. The files. The files she had been gathering were hidden in her locker, a USB drive wrapped inside a surgical glove, the same files that would later blow the case open. But that night, as the city slept, St. Andrews was already spiraling into chaos. News outlets caught wind within hours, police swarmed the building, the board of directors released a one-line statement: "We are cooperating fully with authorities." Behind the scenes, however, panic spread. Administrators scrambled to erase digital trails. Certain documents disappeared from the internal server. Someone even tried to access the staff surveillance logs, but they were locked by Evan Cross. He had already downloaded a backup. Evan didn't sleep that night. When he heard about the shooting, he drove straight to the hospital. He demanded to see security footage. At first, they refused, but when he flashed his compliance credentials, they relented. He watched the footage in silence, Claire walking down the corridor, Hale following seconds later, then a burst of light from the muzzle, Claire falling, Hale stepping back, hesitating, then walking away. No sound, just images, but it told the whole story. By morning, the city was demanding answers. Hale's reputation had made him untouchable for years, the kind of doctor journalists praised, donors adored, and politicians called a pillar of the community. No one wanted to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. A nationwide manhunt began. Hale's house was searched. His private clinic sealed. Inside his office, investigators found locked cabinets filled with patient files that had never been submitted to hospital archives, dozens of names, many marked donor match confirmed, but the recipients unlisted. What they uncovered next was almost unthinkable: a network of illicit operations, organ extractions, unrecorded transplants, and falsified death certificates. St. Andrews wasn't just a hospital anymore, it was a front for something monstrous, and Claire had found the first thread. Meanwhile, she remained in critical condition, sedated, breathing through a tube. Doctors said it was a miracle she was alive at all, but what they didn't know was that her survival would become the one thing Hale hadn't planned for. Because when the police found him weeks later hiding in his cousin's farmhouse, unshaven, exhausted, his first words to investigators were chilling. She was never supposed to survive. The confession sent shockwaves through the medical community. It wasn't just about one man's greed. It was about a system that had let him rise unchecked, that rewarded power, silenced dissent, and turned human lives into assets. And as the media tore the story apart, one question haunted everyone inside St. Andrews: how deep did it go? How many people knew, and how many had chosen not to see? For Evan, it became a mission. He compiled every file Claire had collected and handed them to the investigators. He also testified, describing in detail how Claire had warned him, how she'd known something terrible was hiding behind those pristine walls. But the hospital board wasn't done protecting itself. They claimed Hale had acted alone. They painted Claire as a disgruntled employee. One executive even told the press she was mentally unstable from overwork. For a moment, it seemed like the truth might die in the same corridor where she had almost bled out. Justice, it seemed, was still negotiable. Do you think justice was still possible at this point, or had the system already decided her fate? Tell me what you believe in the comments. Because for Claire, the fight wasn't over, not even close. While Hale awaited trial and the hospital tried to bury the story, she was waking up piece by piece inside the ICU, her body broken, her memory fractured, but her resolve still intact. She couldn't speak at first. The bullets had damaged her lungs, so she wrote instead, one word, shaky but clear, on a notepad the nurses kept by her bed: truth. And that word, that single defiance, would soon ignite the reckoning no one at St. Andrews saw coming. Because survival wasn't the end of her story, it was just the beginning of her fight. For 47 days, Claire Morgan lay suspended between life and death. Her body was weak. Her mind, trapped between fragments of memory, flashes of light, a voice shouting, the echo of her own footsteps. But slowly the fog began to clear. The first time she opened her eyes, she saw the ceiling lights of a room she didn't recognize. Her chest burned. Tubes ran from her arms. She tried to speak, but her throat gave only silence. Then she saw it, a small whiteboard on her bedside table. Someone had written, "You're safe now." But safety, she would soon learn, was an illusion. In those early days, the nurses whispered her name like a secret. Reporters crowded the front gates, and in the halls, administrators walked quickly, eyes averted. The hospital that once celebrated her now wished she would simply disappear. Her friend Evan was the only one who visited every day. He brought updates about the investigation, the press, the files she had saved. He told her that Hale had been captured, that her name was all over the news, that she was being called the whistleblower nurse. She shook her head when she heard it. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt broken. Her hands trembled when she tried to write. Her reflection in the window barely looked like her anymore. Still, she began to remember bit by bit the confrontation, the anger, the gun. She'd wake in the night gasping, hearing the echo of those shots, but each time she steadied herself with one thought: I'm still here. And that, she realized, meant something. The detectives came 2 weeks after she could finally speak again. They were polite, careful, as if afraid her words might break her. But she didn't hold back. She told them everything she'd seen, the missing reports, the falsified data, the warnings she'd ignored. She gave them names, dates, even the times she'd been followed in the parking lot. When she finished, one of the detectives said quietly, "You've done more than enough, you don't have to keep doing this." But she looked at him and said, "I do, because if I stop, he wins." From that day forward, her hospital room became a war room prosecutors visited. Lawyers debated what to disclose, and journalists waited in the lobby, desperate for a glimpse of the woman who had exposed one of the largest medical corruption networks in the country. But it wasn't easy. The hospital fought back. Their legal team argued that Hale's actions were personal crimes, not institutional. They claimed Claire's data had been illegally obtained. They questioned her credibility, her stability, even her motives. They wanted to turn her courage into suspicion. For weeks, her image was everywhere. Some called her a hero, others called her a liar. She stopped turning on the TV. In private, she broke down more than once. The physical pain was one thing, the emotional one was worse. She missed her old life, her sense of purpose, her patience. Now she was the patient, trapped in the same system she once believed in. Evan tried to help her stay grounded. He'd bring coffee, tell jokes, try to make her laugh, but even he couldn't protect her from what came next. One morning, as he entered her room, he looked pale. He told her that someone had leaked her personal medical records to the press, her address, her condition, even her chart notes. It was meant to intimidate her, to remind her that even now they could reach her. Claire didn't flinch. She picked up her notebook and wrote 3 words. "Let them try." Because by then, something had shifted in her. She realized survival had given her a voice, and she intended to use it. A month later, she made her first public appearance, still weak, still scarred, but standing in a press conference outside the courthouse. She spoke slowly, every word deliberate. "This isn't about one man, it's about every patient who trusted us, every nurse who stayed silent out of fear. If we forget that hospitals exist to save lives, not trade them, we lose our humanity." Her voice cracked halfway through, but it didn't matter. Her message landed like thunder. That night, the footage went viral, and for the first time, the public turned not against her but for her. Protests erupted outside St. Andrews. Families of former patients demanded answers, and the government launched a full federal investigation into the hospital's practices. Inside those polished walls, executives began resigning one by one. Emails surfaced, transactions traced, and the illusion of excellence in care finally crumbled under the weight of truth. Still, the hardest day came when Claire had to testify. In that courtroom, she faced Hale again. He looked smaller than she remembered, unshaven, hollow, stripped of the authority that once filled every room he entered. But his eyes were still cold. When their gazes met, she didn't look away. The prosecutor asked her to recount the night of the shooting. Her voice didn't waver. She described everything, from the moment he told her to stay behind to the flash of the gun. Each sentence was a wound reopened, but she spoke them anyway. When asked why she thought he did it, she answered simply, "Because I wasn't afraid anymore." Across the courtroom, Hale smirked, but when the prosecutor played the security footage, the one Evan had preserved, that smirk vanished. The jury saw it all, the approach, the argument, the shots, and the way he walked away, calm and deliberate. By the time the tape ended, the entire room was silent, and in that silence, something shifted. The weight of denial, of complicity, finally broke. The verdict wouldn't come for weeks, but everyone in that room already knew guilt wasn't just about evidence anymore, it was about conscience. Outside, as cameras flashed, a journalist asked Claire what justice would look like for her. She paused for a long time before answering. "Justice," she said, "isn't about punishment, it's about truth staying alive." The months that followed were slow, quiet, and filled with healing. Claire moved out of the city into a small coastal town where the air smelled like salt and pine instead of antiseptic. She volunteered at a local clinic, not as a nurse, but as a counselor for whistleblowers and medical staff struggling with guilt or fear. She said helping others find their courage helped her reclaim hers. Evan stayed in touch, though he left the hospital system entirely. He now worked with a nonprofit focused on medical transparency. They talked often about ethics, about loss, about what it means to start over. Claire's scars faded, but not her conviction. She began writing essays about accountability, the silent hierarchies of medicine, and the cost of integrity. Her words began appearing in journals, and slowly her story became a symbol not just of survival but of reform. Hospitals across the country began implementing stricter oversight policies. New whistleblower protections were signed into law, unofficially known as the Clare Act. For every life lost in the shadows of greed, her courage brought light. And though she rarely spoke about that night anymore, when asked if she forgave Hale, she always gave the same answer. "I don't forgive what he did, but I refuse to let it define me." Because sometimes justice isn't a verdict, it's the decision to keep living with purpose, even when the world tried to end yours. A year passed, seasons turned. The headlines that once screamed betrayal and corruption began to fade from front pages, but for Claire Morgan, every sunrise still felt like a small act of defiance, each breath proof that she had survived a system designed to silence her. The trial of Dr. Nathan Hale became one of the most watched cases in modern medical history. The prosecution laid out everything: the falsified donor lists, the offshore accounts, the evidence hidden in his office. They showed how he had turned the hospital into a personal empire, using patients as collateral and trust as currency. Claire's testimony, raw and unwavering, anchored the entire case. Even the defense team, sharp, relentless, couldn't shake her calm. When they asked why she didn't just walk away, she said, "Because the truth doesn't need permission to exist." After 6 weeks of arguments, the jury took only 4 hours to decide: guilty on all counts: attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and unlawful organ trafficking. Hale's sentence was life without parole. The courtroom fell silent when the judge read the verdict. Claire sat in the front row, fingers clasped tightly around a small cross her mother had given her years earlier. When Hale was led away, their eyes met one last time. There was no anger left in her, just a quiet kind of pity. Because she finally understood, some people chase power not to heal others but to fill the emptiness inside themselves. And that emptiness, no matter how it's dressed in credentials and applause, always ends the same way: alone. Outside, the crowd erupted. Reporters shouted her name, strangers held signs that read "Truth Heals" and "Justice for Claire." But she didn't stay long. She slipped away quietly, walking down the courthouse steps into a world that felt both familiar and brand new. In the months that followed, the investigation widened. Over a dozen hospital executives were charged with negligence and obstruction. Several medical boards instituted independent auditing systems for transplant programs. The scandal reshaped the national conversation around medical ethics and whistleblower protection. And for the first time in decades, people began asking hard questions, the kind Claire once asked alone. Questions like, who watches those who save lives, and what happens when healing becomes business? Claire didn't return to St. Andrews. She couldn't. The building had been renamed under new management, its walls repainted, its corridors sterilized of the past. But for her, the ghosts remained. She once said in an interview, "You can rebuild a hospital, but you can't rebuild trust overnight." Instead, she built something new, a foundation, small at first, funded mostly by donations from people she'd never met. It offered legal and emotional support to healthcare workers who found themselves torn between silence and truth. She called it the Lumen Project, a name that meant light in the dark. She traveled, spoke at universities, met young nurses who told her they'd chosen this path because of her. One student told her, "You made me believe one person can still matter." Claire smiled, but her eyes carried the weight of everything it had cost her. Because courage, she knew, was never free. It demanded everything: your peace, your comfort, sometimes your future. But it also gave something back: meaning, and meaning, she decided, was worth it. On the anniversary of the shooting, she returned to the place where it all began. The East Corridor had been rebuilt, new floors, new lighting, the plaque above the entrance now read, "Dedicated to those who speak the truth, even when it costs everything." She stood there alone for a long while, no press, no ceremony, just silence, the kind of silence that holds both grief and peace. Then she did something simple. She placed a single white lily on the floor, not for Hale, not even for herself, but for the patients whose stories would never be told. When she walked away, she didn't look back. Because some chapters don't end with vengeance, they end with understanding, and sometimes that's the truest kind of justice. In interviews years later, when asked what she'd learned, she said, "The hardest part of telling the truth isn't the danger, it's watching how easily people pretend not to hear it." Those words struck something deep, not just in medicine, but in anyone who had ever faced corruption, betrayal, or fear and still chose to speak. Because that's what Claire's story became, not a tragedy but a reminder. A reminder that even in the cleanest corridors, shadows can thrive, that even in the most respected systems, silence can kill, and that courage doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers, "I'll try again tomorrow." Claire's life today is quiet. She lives by the sea, teaches part-time, and spends her evenings walking the shoreline with a notebook in hand. Her scars ache when it rains, but she says they're just reminders that truth leaves marks, but those marks mean you survived. Once a young journalist asked her if she ever regretted speaking out. She thought for a long moment before replying. Regret belongs to those who still have something to hide. Maybe that's why her story still resonates, because in a world where power often drowns out honesty, one woman proved that truth can still stand, fragile, bleeding, but alive. And that sometimes the most unbelievable part of a story isn't the crime or the corruption or even the survival, it's that one voice was enough to change everything. If this story left you thinking or feeling something, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Your voice keeps these stories alive. And if you haven't already, subscribe so I can keep bringing you true stories that prove why truth still matters.